Ladies and gentlemen, there is a powerful truth. Many people fail to understand what looks like pride is often pain. What appears to be confidence can sometimes be a carefully constructed shield protecting a wounded identity. When you observe narcissistic behavior, you are not merely witnessing arrogance. You are often witnessing unresolved suffering. A desperate need for control is rarely about strength. It is almost always about fear. When you observe someone who must dominate every conversation, dictate every plan, correct every detail, and manipulate every outcome, you are not witnessing confidence. You are witnessing anxiety dressed in authority. Control becomes their coping mechanism. It becomes the strategy they use to protect a fragile inner world that feels unstable and unsafe. Control is born from insecurity. When a person does not feel secure within themselves, they attempt to secure everything around them. They try to manage people the way a nervous leader manages a crisis. They attempt to predict reactions, engineer responses, and eliminate uncertainty. Why? Because uncertainty threatens exposure, and exposure threatens the image they have carefully constructed. At the root of this behavior is often a deep fear of abandonment. If they can control the narrative, they believe they can prevent rejection. If they can control the relationship, they believe they can prevent betrayal. If they can control your perception, they believe they can prevent you from seeing their flaws. Control becomes a shield against loss. It is their attempt to guarantee loyalty by force rather than earning trust through authenticity. But here is the paradox: the more a person tries to control others, the more they push them away. Healthy relationships thrive on freedom, not domination. Love cannot breathe in an atmosphere of manipulation. Respect cannot grow in soil where fear is planted. When someone constantly dictates what others should think, feel, or do, it reveals an inability to trust both themselves and the people around them. This need for control also exposes a fragile identity. A secure individual can tolerate disagreement. They can accept that someone sees things differently. They can handle criticism without collapsing internally. But when identity is weak, even small differences feel like threats. A different opinion feels like disrespect. A boundary feels like rebellion. Independence feels like betrayal, so they tighten their grip. Notice how controlling behavior often escalates when they sense distance. If a partner becomes more independent, they increase restrictions. If a colleague gains recognition, they increase interference. If a friend sets boundaries, they increase guilt or emotional pressure. Control intensifies when insecurity rises. It is a reaction to fear, not an expression of strength. The irony is that true power requires no force. Real leadership inspires. It does not intimidate. Real authority empowers others. It does not suppress them. The person who is deeply secure does not need to micromanage every situation because their confidence is internal. They understand that they cannot control everything, and they do not need to. They are anchored within. When someone is deeply suffering inside, uncertainty feels unbearable. They may have grown up in environments where chaos ruled, where love was inconsistent, or where mistakes were punished harshly. In such conditions, control becomes a survival tool. It becomes the way they learn to feel safe. Over time, what was once a protective strategy becomes a destructive habit. Control also serves as a distraction from inner emptiness. When they are busy orchestrating everyone else's life, they do not have to confront their own unresolved pain. When they are correcting others, they avoid examining themselves. It is easier to manage people than to manage personal wounds. It is easier to dominate conversations than to sit quietly with uncomfortable emotions. But control cannot heal insecurity. It can only temporarily suppress it. The more they attempt to command their environment, the more fragile they become internally. Because deep down, they know they cannot truly control everything. Life will always introduce variables. People will always exercise free will. Circumstances will always shift. And when reality refuses to obey, frustration erupts. This is why controlling individuals often display intense anger when things do not go according to plan. The anger is not just about the situation. It is about the loss of psychological safety. It is about the fear of being exposed as powerless. Control gave them the illusion of stability. When that illusion breaks, panic follows. The path to healing begins with surrender. Not surrender to weakness, but surrender to truth. The truth that no human being can control another without damaging both. The truth that love must be chosen, not forced. The truth that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. The truth that security must come from within. When a person begins to confront their fear of abandonment, when they acknowledge their insecurity instead of masking it with dominance, transformation becomes possible. They learn that vulnerability is not weakness. They learn that boundaries are not rejection. They learn that disagreement is not humiliation. They learn that their worth is not dependent on controlling outcomes. True strength is self-governance. It is the ability to regulate your own emotions rather than regulating everyone else's behavior. It is the discipline to examine your own motives before criticizing others. It is the courage to admit when fear, not wisdom, is driving your decisions. The desperate need for control is a silent cry for safety. It is a signal of internal instability. And until that instability is addressed, no amount of authority, dominance, or manipulation will bring peace. Peace comes when a person realizes that security is not found in controlling the world. It is found in mastering the self. A desperate need for control is rarely about strength. It is about fear. Control is the strategy of a heart that does not trust stability. When someone feels secure within themselves, they can allow life to unfold without micromanaging every detail. They can allow others to speak, to disagree, to grow independently. But when insecurity lies beneath the surface, control becomes a coping mechanism. It becomes a way to reduce anxiety. It becomes a shield against unpredictability. At the core of excessive control is the fear of exposure. A person who is deeply suffering inside often believes that if others truly see their weaknesses, they will be rejected. So they try to manage perceptions. They control conversations to avoid uncomfortable truths. They dominate decisions to avoid feeling irrelevant. They dictate emotional responses to avoid vulnerability. What appears as dominance is often a defense against feeling powerless. Control also grows from the fear of abandonment. When someone has an unstable sense of self-worth, they may attempt to control relationships tightly. They may become possessive, manipulative, or overly critical. They may test loyalty constantly, not because they feel superior, but because they feel replaceable. When a person does not believe they are enough, they try to secure attachment through force rather than trust. The tragedy is that control produces the very outcome they fear. The tighter they grip, the more people withdraw. The more they demand compliance, the less authentic connection they experience. Relationships built on control cannot breathe. And when relationships cannot breathe, they slowly suffocate. Control is also connected to internal chaos. When someone feels emotionally unstable inside, they attempt to create order outside. They arrange, command, correct, and supervise everything around them because their internal world feels unpredictable. But external order cannot heal internal disorder. You can organize your environment and still be fragmented inside. The educational lesson here is profound. Real power is self-governance. The person who cannot control their temper will attempt to control others. The person who cannot control their insecurity will attempt to control outcomes. But the one who masters their fears does not need to dominate their environment. Self-leadership eliminates the obsession with leading everyone else. When you understand this, you begin to see that excessive control is not confidence. It is compensation. It is an attempt to stabilize a fragile identity. And until that identity is healed, no amount of external authority will bring internal peace. Another hidden sign of deep internal suffering is chronic envy. Envy is more than jealousy. It is internal comparison that produces pain. It is the silent confession of inadequacy. When someone is constantly disturbed by the success, beauty, talent, or happiness of others, it is often because those qualities highlight something they believe they lack. Envy reveals a distorted self-perception. A secure person can celebrate others because they are not threatened by someone else's progress. They understand that another person's light does not diminish their own. But when identity is fragile, every success story feels like personal failure. Every compliment given to someone else feels like a subtraction from their worth. Chronic envy also exposes a misplaced source of value. When a person defines their identity by comparison, they are trapped in a competition that never ends. There will always be someone wealthier, more attractive, more accomplished, or more recognized. If worth is measured externally, peace will always be temporary. And temporary peace produces permanent anxiety. The suffering inside an envious heart is rooted in self-rejection. Envy says, "I am not enough as I am." It whispers that others are winning while you are losing. It magnifies perceived flaws and minimizes personal strengths. Instead of inspiring growth, it produces resentment. Instead of motivating improvement, it encourages criticism. This is why envy often expresses itself through subtle attacks. The envious person may downplay others' achievements. They may question motives. They may spread negativity, not because they truly despise the other person, but because admiration feels too painful. It is easier to diminish someone else than to confront your own dissatisfaction. Yet envy carries within it an important lesson. It reveals desire. If someone else's success triggers emotion, it may indicate a dream that has been neglected. The problem is not the desire, the problem is the refusal to develop oneself. Instead of using envy as information, they use it as ammunition. Education teaches us that the cure for envy is purpose. When a person discovers their unique assignment in life, comparison loses its grip. When you understand that your path is distinct, you stop measuring your journey against someone else's timeline. Purpose transforms competition into inspiration. The deeper truth is that envy is not hatred of others, it is disappointment in oneself. And disappointment unaddressed becomes bitterness. But disappointment confronted becomes development. If someone is deeply suffering inside, envy will continue to torment them until they shift their focus inward, until they stop asking, why them, and start asking, what can I build? Until they move from comparison to contribution. Because peace does not come from outperforming others. It comes from fulfilling your own potential. And when a person embraces their own growth, the success of others becomes proof that achievement is possible, not evidence that they are lacking. That transformation is the difference between a wounded ego and a healed identity. When a person lives on constant validation, they are revealing more than they realize. The endless need for praise, applause, recognition, and reassurance is not a sign of greatness. It is a sign of hunger, and not physical hunger, identity hunger. When someone is deeply secure, appreciation feels good, but it is not required for survival. However, when someone is internally fractured, validation becomes emotional oxygen. Without it, they feel invisible. Without it, they feel insignificant. This is why some individuals cannot tolerate being ignored. Silence feels like rejection. A lack of attention feels like abandonment. They may post excessively, exaggerate achievements, dominate conversations, or constantly remind others of their value. It is not always about pride. It is often about fear, the fear of not being enough. Deep inside, there may be a voice whispering, if they stop applauding me, I disappear. That internal voice drives behavior that appears confident on the outside, but fragile on the inside. The tragedy is that external validation can never permanently fix internal insecurity. It is temporary medicine. The applause fades, compliments stop, attention shifts. And when it does, the same emptiness returns. This creates a cycle: seek validation, feel temporary relief, lose validation, feel pain, seek more validation. The cycle continues because the real problem has not been addressed, a wounded self concept. True stability begins when a person learns to define themselves by purpose and values rather than by applause. Control is another powerful sign of hidden suffering. A person who must control every situation is often trying to control their own anxiety. Control gives the illusion of safety. If they can predict everything, manage everyone, and dictate outcomes, then they believe they can avoid emotional pain. But the root of this behavior is not strength, it is fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of being rejected, fear of losing relevance. When someone interrupts constantly, makes decisions for others, manipulates circumstances, or becomes angry when things do not go their way, it often reflects an internal instability. They are not simply trying to dominate others, they are trying to protect themselves from uncertainty. Uncertainty feels threatening because it removes their ability to manage how they are perceived. If they cannot control the environment, they cannot control the image. And if they cannot control the image, they fear the truth might surface. But here is the deeper lesson: control is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance. It requires monitoring everyone's reactions, words, and behaviors. It creates tension in relationships because people eventually resist being managed. The more control someone exerts, the more fragile their world becomes. Relationships weaken, trust erodes, resentment grows. And ironically, the very thing they fear, abandonment or rejection, becomes more likely because people feel suffocated. Freedom in relationships requires trust. Trust requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires courage. When a person learns that they do not need to control everything to be safe, they begin to heal. They realize that their worth is not determined by outcomes, and their identity is not threatened by unpredictability. Letting go of control is not weakness, it is emotional maturity. Emotional volatility is another revealing sign of inner suffering. When a small comment triggers an explosive reaction, the response is rarely about the moment itself. It is often connected to older wounds that were never resolved. A mild critique may feel like a personal attack because it touches an existing insecurity. A simple disagreement may feel like betrayal because it activates a deep fear of rejection. When emotions swing rapidly between charm and rage, affection and withdrawal, confidence and collapse, it signals internal instability. This instability usually originates from unresolved shame. Shame is one of the most painful human emotions. It whispers, "You are flawed. You are defective. You are not enough." When shame is buried instead of healed, it does not disappear. It waits. And when triggered, it erupts. Anger becomes a shield against shame. Instead of feeling exposed, the person lashes out. Instead of admitting hurt, they blame others. Instead of processing pain, they project it. Emotional outbursts temporarily shift attention away from their vulnerability. But once the moment passes, the underlying wound remains untouched. The educational truth here is simple unprocessed pain does not stay silent. It expresses itself through behavior. If someone refuses to confront their internal suffering, it will surface through instability, defensiveness, and overreaction. Emotional maturity requires self-reflection. It requires asking difficult questions. Why did that comment hurt so much? Why do I feel threatened so easily? Why does disagreement feel like danger? Healing begins when a person stops defending their reactions and starts examining them. It begins when they acknowledge that their emotional responses may be rooted in past wounds rather than present realities. Growth is not found in denying pain, it is found in understanding it. Every human being has insecurities. Every human being has emotional triggers. But the difference between dysfunction and development lies in awareness. When awareness increases, reactions decrease. When understanding deepens, stability grows. And when identity is healed, the need for validation, control, and emotional volatility begins to fade. The path to wholeness is not about appearing strong. It is about becoming strong, internally, quietly, authentically. True power is not in dominating others or demanding applause. It is in mastering oneself. A desperate need for control is often one of the clearest signs of internal suffering. Control is rarely about strength, it is usually about fear. When a person feels unstable within, they attempt to stabilize their environment. They try to manage conversations, dictate decisions, and influence how others perceive them. This behavior is not random. It is rooted in a deep anxiety that if they do not control the narrative, they will be exposed. Exposure to them feels like destruction. The need to control people, outcomes, and even emotions is an attempt to prevent rejection. They believe that if they manage everything perfectly, they will never be abandoned. But control is a fragile strategy. The more they try to dominate situations, the more resistance they create, and that resistance reinforces their fear. What they do not realize is that real security does not come from controlling the outside world. It comes from mastering the inner world. When identity is secure, a person does not panic when things move beyond their authority. They adapt. But when identity is wounded, unpredictability feels like a threat. So they tighten their grip, unaware that they are squeezing the life out of their own relationships. Exaggerated arrogance is another powerful signal of hidden suffering. True confidence is quiet and stable. It does not need applause to survive. But arrogance constantly seeks attention because it is trying to silence an inner voice of inadequacy. When someone repeatedly reminds others of their superiority, it is often because they are unconvinced themselves. Arrogance becomes a performance. It is carefully constructed to project power, intelligence, and dominance. Yet beneath that performance may lie deep shame. Shame about past failures, rejection, or feelings of not being enough. Instead of confronting that shame, they bury it under grandiosity. They exaggerate their achievements. They minimize the contributions of others. They turn every interaction into a competition. This is not strength. It is self-protection. Unfortunately, the mask of arrogance prevents genuine connection. People may admire the image, but they rarely connect with it. Over time, the individual becomes trapped in their own performance. They must continuously prove their worth, because the moment they stop, their hidden insecurities resurface. The tragedy is that the very behavior designed to protect them from feeling small often leaves them isolated and misunderstood. Emotional volatility is also a sign of unresolved internal pain. When someone reacts intensely to minor criticism, it is rarely about the present moment. The reaction is amplified because it touches an old wound. A simple disagreement may feel like humiliation. A small correction may feel like an attack on their identity. This heightened sensitivity reveals fragility beneath the surface. If their self-image is built on perfection, any imperfection feels catastrophic. So they respond with anger, defensiveness, or blame. Emotional outbursts are often defensive explosions meant to protect a fragile ego. Instead of processing criticism as feedback, they interpret it as rejection. And rejection triggers deep fear. What many do not understand is that emotionally healthy individuals can tolerate discomfort. They can separate their identity from their mistakes. But when identity and performance are fused together, every mistake feels like a personal collapse. Emotional volatility becomes a shield. By reacting aggressively, they attempt to shift focus away from their vulnerability. Yet each outburst reveals the very insecurity they are trying to hide. The lack of emotional regulation is not simply immaturity. It is often unhealed, pain-demanding attention. Chronic envy is another hidden indicator of internal suffering. Envy is more than wanting what someone else has. It is a painful comparison that reinforces feelings of deficiency. When someone cannot celebrate the growth, success, or happiness of others, it is often because those achievements highlight what they believe they lack. Instead of being inspired, they feel threatened. Another person's success becomes evidence of their own inadequacy. This internal comparison fuels resentment. Rather than confronting their own unmet goals or insecurities, they may attempt to devalue the achievements of others. They criticize, dismiss, or undermine because it temporarily reduces the sting of comparison. But envy never truly satisfies. It is a constant reminder that their identity is dependent on being superior. If someone else shines, they feel dimmed. This reveals a deep misunderstanding of self-worth. Healthy self-worth is not competitive. It does not require others to fail in order to feel valuable. But when worth is built on comparison, life becomes a never-ending contest. Envy exposes a fragile identity that has not yet discovered its unique purpose. Until a person finds meaning within themselves, they will continue to measure their value against everyone around them. And that endless comparison becomes its own quiet form of suffering. One of the clearest hidden signs that a narcissist is deeply suffering inside is an excessive need for validation. When a person constantly seeks praise, applause, and recognition, it is not always because they believe they are superior. Often, it is because they are uncertain. They have built their self-worth on external reactions rather than internal conviction. If no one is clapping, they feel invisible. If no one is admiring, they feel inadequate. This creates a cycle of emotional dependency where their mood rises and falls based on how others respond to them. The applause becomes a temporary medication for a deeper wound of insecurity. But external validation can never permanently fill an internal void. The more they chase it, the emptier they feel. This is not strength, it is silent suffering hidden behind performance. Another powerful sign of internal pain is their overwhelming need for control. Control is rarely about leadership, it is usually about fear. A person who must dominate conversations, dictate outcomes, and manipulate circumstances is often terrified of unpredictability. Uncertainty threatens their carefully constructed image. If others act independently, they feel rejected. If situations do not go according to plan, they feel exposed. Control becomes their shield against abandonment and embarrassment. But living in constant control is exhausting. It requires hyper-vigilance and distrust. It prevents healthy relationships because trust requires surrender, and surrender feels dangerous to someone who fears losing authority. Their desire to control is actually a confession of anxiety. They are not trying to overpower others. They are trying to quiet the chaos within themselves. Emotional volatility is another hidden indicator of deep internal suffering. When a small criticism triggers explosive anger or dramatic defensiveness, the reaction often has little to do with the present moment. It is connected to unresolved wounds from the past. A simple comment can feel like an attack on their entire identity because their sense of self is fragile. Instead of processing feedback calmly, they interpret it as humiliation. The anger becomes a protective wall. By reacting aggressively, they shift attention away from their vulnerability. But inside, they are deeply affected. They replay conversations, dwell on perceived disrespect, and struggle with intense feelings of shame. The outburst you see is only the surface. Beneath it is a person who feels easily threatened and emotionally unsafe. Chronic envy also reveals hidden suffering. When a narcissist cannot celebrate someone else's success, it is not just competitiveness, it is comparison rooted in insecurity. Every achievement by another person feels like evidence of their own deficiency. Instead of feeling inspired, they feel diminished. Envy grows when identity is unclear. If you do not know your own value, you measure yourself against everyone else. Their jealousy may lead them to criticize, minimize, or sabotage others. But these behaviors are defensive. They are trying to protect a fragile ego from feelings of inferiority. Envy is painful because it constantly reminds them of what they believe they lack. It robs them of joy and keeps them trapped in rivalry instead of growth. Perhaps the most heartbreaking sign of internal suffering is their inability to form deep, authentic connections. While they may appear socially confident, many struggle with genuine intimacy. True connection requires vulnerability, honesty, and emotional openness. But vulnerability feels risky when you fear rejection. So instead of showing their authentic selves, they project an idealized image. Relationships become performances rather than partnerships. Over time, this creates isolation. People may admire them, fear them, or even follow them, but very few truly know them. And being unknown is a lonely place. They may never admit it, but loneliness weighs heavily on a heart that cannot safely reveal itself. The very defenses designed to protect them from pain end up intensifying it. Understanding these signs is not about excusing harmful behavior. Pain does not justify hurting others. However, recognizing the suffering behind the behavior gives clarity. It reminds us that arrogance can hide insecurity, control can hide fear, anger can hide shame, envy can hide inadequacy, and isolation can hide longing. The true path to healing for anyone displaying these traits is self-awareness. Until a person confronts the roots of their insecurity, they will continue building masks instead of character. Real strength is not found in domination or admiration. It is found in the courage to face one's own broken places. When a person develops internal worth, the hunger for validation decreases. When they embrace vulnerability, control loosens its grip. When they process past wounds, emotional reactions stabilize. When they discover purpose, envy fades. When they accept themselves, authentic connection becomes possible. The loudest ego often hides the deepest insecurity. And the person who appears untouchable may be fighting silent battles within. True transformation begins not with proving superiority, but with healing identity. Control is rarely about strength. It is often about fear wearing armor. When a person constantly tries to dominate conversations, dictate decisions, or manipulate outcomes, it reveals something deeper than a desire for authority. It exposes an internal insecurity that feels threatened by uncertainty. Control becomes a coping mechanism. It is an attempt to create stability in a mind that feels unstable. If everything and everyone can be managed, then nothing unexpected can expose their weaknesses. But this constant need to control drains energy and damages relationships. It pushes people away rather than drawing them closer. The tragedy is that the more they try to secure themselves through control, the more insecure they become. True security does not come from controlling external circumstances. It comes from mastering internal fears. Until that fear is addressed, the cycle of domination and disappointment continues. Arrogance is another mask that often hides deep shame. Loud self-promotion, exaggerated achievements, and constant comparison are rarely signs of genuine confidence. True confidence is quiet and steady. It does not need to compete for attention. Arrogance, however, shouts because it is trying to silence an internal voice of inadequacy. When someone constantly elevates themselves while diminishing others, it often reveals a fragile self-image. They are not trying to prove they are better. They are trying to convince themselves they are enough. But no amount of external praise can permanently silence internal shame. The louder the pride, the deeper the hidden wound may be. Healing begins when the performance stops, when a person can admit, even privately, that their worth is not built on superiority, but on authenticity. Real confidence grows when comparison ends and self-acceptance begins. Emotional volatility is another powerful indicator of internal suffering. When small criticisms trigger intense anger, when minor disagreements turn into major conflicts, it often signals unresolved pain. The reaction is rarely about the present moment. It is connected to past wounds that were never healed. Criticism feels like rejection, feedback feels like humiliation, and disagreement feels like abandonment, because deep inside there is a belief that being imperfect equals being unworthy. This is why emotional reactions can seem disproportionate. The pain is cumulative. Every perceived slight adds to a history of insecurity. Instead of processing emotions in a healthy way, they erupt. The tragedy is that these outbursts often push away the very people who might offer understanding. Emotional maturity requires self-reflection. It requires the humility to pause and ask, why did this affect me so deeply? Growth begins when responsibility replaces blame. Chronic envy is another silent confession of inner dissatisfaction. When someone cannot celebrate the success of others, it reveals an internal comparison that never rests. Envy says, their success exposes my failure. It is not simply wanting what someone else has, it is resenting them for having it. This resentment grows from a belief that there is not enough success, attention, or value to go around. Instead of being inspired, they feel threatened. Instead of learning, they criticize. But envy is a mirror. It reflects unfulfilled potential and ignored purpose. The pain intensifies when a person senses they are capable of more, but refuses to confront the discipline and growth required to achieve it. True transformation occurs when envy becomes motivation, when instead of tearing others down, a person builds themselves up. Fulfillment replaces resentment when identity is rooted in purpose rather than comparison. Isolation often follows these patterns. While someone may appear socially active, Genuine intimacy can feel terrifying. Real connection demands vulnerability. It requires honesty about fears, flaws, and failures. But if someone believes their authentic self is not lovable, they will avoid that exposure at all costs. They may maintain relationships based on image, status, or usefulness rather than emotional depth. Over time, this creates loneliness. Surrounded by people yet unknown, admired yet not understood, the inability to form deep bonds intensifies the internal suffering. Humans are wired for connection. When relationships remain superficial, the soul feels disconnected. Healing requires courage, the courage to be seen without the mask. True belonging begins where performance ends. Finally, the avoidance of self-awareness keeps the cycle alive. Reflection can feel dangerous because it threatens the carefully constructed identity. To look inward means confronting painful truths. It means acknowledging insecurity, fear, jealousy, and unresolved trauma. But without self-awareness, there can be no growth. Blame becomes easier than responsibility. Denial feels safer than change. Yet transformation demands honesty. It demands the strength to admit, I am hurting and I need to heal. This is not weakness, it is maturity. The moment a person stops defending their image and starts developing their character, everything shifts. Suffering loses its grip when truth is embraced. Freedom begins when self-deception ends. Envy is one of the clearest yet most misunderstood signs of internal suffering. When a narcissistic individual constantly compares themselves to others, diminishes another person's success, or reacts negatively to someone else's growth, it is not simply competitiveness. It is a mirror reflecting internal inadequacy. Envy exposes a belief that there is not enough value within themselves. Instead of being inspired by the success of others, they feel threatened by it. Why? Because another person's achievement quietly challenges the fragile identity they are trying to protect. If someone else shines, it forces them to confront the fear that they are not enough. Rather than building their own capacity, they attempt to tear down what reminds them of their insecurity. This pattern reveals deep emotional pain, the pain of measuring self-worth by comparison instead of purpose. Isolation is another powerful indicator of hidden suffering. Although narcissistic personalities often appear surrounded by people, attention, and activity, true intimacy usually escapes them. Authentic relationships require vulnerability, empathy, and mutual respect. But when someone is deeply afraid of being exposed as flawed or inadequate, vulnerability feels like danger. So they substitute performance for connection. They charm, impress, and dominate conversations, yet rarely allow anyone to truly see their fears. Over time, this creates emotional distance. People may be physically present, but relationally absent. And in that absence, loneliness grows. The tragedy is that the very defense mechanisms designed to protect them end up isolating them further. They crave admiration, but fear authenticity. And in that tension, they suffer silently. A fragile identity is often at the root of this suffering. When a person does not have a secure sense of who they are, they construct an image to compensate. That image must be maintained at all costs. Every interaction becomes a stage. Every conversation becomes a performance. But sustaining a false identity is exhausting. It requires constant reinforcement through praise, status, or control. The moment those reinforcements disappear, anxiety surfaces. A stable identity is built from self-acceptance and purpose, but a fragile one depends on external applause. This dependence creates internal instability. The individual may appear strong, yet internally they feel like they are standing on unstable ground. Any criticism feels like an earthquake because their foundation is not secure. Another hidden struggle is hypersensitivity to criticism. Even mild feedback can trigger disproportionate anger, defensiveness, or withdrawal. This reaction is not about the present moment alone, it is about accumulated shame that has never been processed. When identity is tied to perfection or superiority, any suggestion of imperfection feels like humiliation. Instead of receiving correction as an opportunity for growth, they interpret it as a personal attack. The intensity of their reaction often reveals how deeply wounded they are. A secure person can evaluate feedback without losing their sense of worth. But someone who is deeply suffering interprets feedback as confirmation of their worst internal fears. There is also a constant internal tension between superiority and inadequacy. On the surface, they project confidence, but beneath that projection lies self-doubt. This creates psychological conflict. They must continuously reinforce the narrative that they are better, smarter, or more important than others. However, the louder they declare superiority, the more it suggests they are trying to silence something within. Genuine confidence is quiet because it does not need validation. But when someone repeatedly emphasizes their greatness, it often signals an attempt to overpower feelings of insignificance. This internal contradiction is emotionally draining and keeps them trapped in a cycle of overcompensation. Control issues further reveal internal fear. The need to dominate decisions, conversations, or relationships often stems from anxiety about unpredictability. When life feels uncertain, controlling others creates an illusion of stability. But control is not strength. It is a coping mechanism. Deep inside, there may be fear of abandonment, betrayal, or rejection. By controlling the environment, they believe they can prevent those painful experiences. Unfortunately, excessive control pushes people away, reinforcing the very fears they were trying to avoid. This cycle intensifies their suffering because each broken relationship confirms their insecurity rather than resolving it. Finally, there is resistance to self-reflection. Looking inward requires courage. It requires acknowledging flaws, confronting past wounds, and accepting responsibility. For someone whose identity depends on appearing flawless, introspection feels threatening. Avoidance becomes safer than awareness. They may blame others, rewrite narratives, or deny obvious truths because facing reality would dismantle the image they depend on. Yet avoidance only prolongs suffering. Healing begins the moment a person chooses honesty over ego. Until that moment, they remain trapped in patterns that protect their pride but poison their peace. Understanding these hidden signs is not about excusing harmful behavior. It is about recognizing that destructive patterns often originate from unresolved pain. The lesson is powerful. When identity is insecure, behavior becomes defensive. When self-worth is external, relationships become transactional. But when a person chooses self-awareness, accountability, and growth, transformation becomes possible. True strength is not found in domination or admiration. It is found in the courage to confront one's own broken places. Narcissism is often misunderstood because it wears the costume of confidence. But when you look deeper, you begin to see that what appears to be strength may actually be a fragile structure built on insecurity. A person who constantly elevates themselves, exaggerates achievements, and seeks superiority is often trying to escape an internal narrative of not feeling enough. When identity is not firmly rooted in self-acceptance, it searches for external evidence to survive. The performance of greatness becomes a compensation for an internal belief of inadequacy. True confidence is quiet and steady, but insecurity is restless and demanding. One of the clearest hidden signs of internal suffering is an excessive need for validation. When someone constantly fishes for compliments, demands recognition, or feels wounded when not praised, it reveals emotional dependence on external approval. Healthy individuals appreciate encouragement, but they are not destroyed without it. However, when validation becomes a daily necessity, it signals emptiness within. It is like pouring water into a bucket with holes. No matter how much praise they receive, it never feels like enough because the root issue is not lack of applause. It is lack of self-worth. Another sign of deep suffering is the need to control people and environments. Control is often mistaken for leadership or authority, but in many cases it is driven by fear. When someone cannot tolerate unpredictability or disagreement, it may be because they are terrified of losing power or being exposed. Control gives them temporary security. If they can manage outcomes, they believe they can prevent rejection. But control is a fragile shield. The more they try to dominate, the more anxious they become because life cannot be fully controlled. Their suffering grows in proportion to their need to manage everything. Arrogance is another mask that hides shame. When a person constantly belittles others, dismisses different opinions, or reacts defensively to minor criticism, it often reflects an internal struggle with self-acceptance. Criticism feels like an attack on their entire identity because their identity is not stable. Instead of processing feedback constructively, they deflect, blame, or retaliate. This exaggerated defense mechanism reveals that beneath the pride lies a wounded sense of self. The louder the ego, the deeper the insecurity it attempts to silence. Emotional volatility is also a powerful indicator of inner turmoil. Sudden rage, dramatic mood swings, or disproportionate reactions to small issues suggest unresolved pain. When someone reacts intensely to minor setbacks, it usually means the trigger touched an old wound. Their nervous system is not responding to the present moment alone, but to accumulated emotional injuries from the past. The anger you see today may be rooted in rejection they experienced years ago. Without healing, those wounds remain active and ready to explode. Envy provides another window into hidden suffering. A person who cannot celebrate the success of others often feels threatened by it. Instead of being inspired, they feel diminished. Another person's achievement becomes proof of their own perceived failure. Envy exposes a comparison-driven mindset, where worth is measured against others rather than grounded in personal growth. This constant comparison is exhausting. It creates internal competition that never ends, leaving them perpetually dissatisfied. Isolation is a quieter but equally telling sign. While some individuals with narcissistic tendencies may appear socially active, their relationships often lack depth. Genuine intimacy requires vulnerability, honesty, and emotional openness. But vulnerability feels dangerous when someone fears that their authentic self is flawed. So they build connections based on image and control rather than authenticity. Over time, this creates loneliness. They may be surrounded by people, yet feel profoundly disconnected. The suffering intensifies because they crave connection, but resist the vulnerability necessary to achieve it. Finally, there is resistance to self-reflection. Deep down, many individuals who display narcissistic behaviors avoid introspection because it threatens their constructed identity. Reflection requires acknowledging mistakes, confronting weaknesses, and accepting responsibility. But if their entire sense of worth is built on superiority, admitting flaws feels unbearable. So they protect themselves through denial. However, growth is impossible without awareness. Avoiding self-examination keeps them trapped in cycles of conflict and dissatisfaction. Understanding these hidden signs is not about excusing harmful behavior. It is about recognizing that broken behavior often stems from broken identity. Pain that is not healed becomes projected onto others. The lesson here is profound. Unaddressed insecurity can evolve into destructive patterns that damage relationships and isolate the individual further. True transformation begins when a person shifts from protecting an image to developing character. It begins when they realize that self-worth cannot be built on dominance, applause, or comparison. Healing requires courage, the courage to face insecurity without masks. When someone learns to anchor their identity internally rather than externally, the need for validation decreases, the urge to control softens, and envy loses its power. The deepest victory is not proving superiority over others. It is mastering one's own fears, insecurities, and wounds. When healing replaces performance, peace replaces pride. And when identity becomes secure, suffering no longer needs to hide behind arrogance. And that is the transformation every wounded soul must choose. The shift from image to identity, from performance to purpose, from pride to peace. Because the loudest ego often hides the deepest pain. And the greatest victory is not over others, it is over oneself.